Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Today we're talking with Agrii fruit agronomists Matt Greep, Emma Smith and Ryan Williams. Why is getting the nutrition right so important in top fruit? In this episode, we're going to talk with the experts, exploring the nutritional requirements of top fruit, the role of tissue analysis, and how to correct deficiencies. And importantly, how does that impact on storage and quality? Ryan, perhaps we can start by asking you the first question. What crops are we talking about when we refer to top fruit?
Well, top fruit includes apples and pears generally, but we'll also be talking a little bit about stone fruit, mainly of which plums and cherries are included.
And Ryan, what is the end market for our top fruit in the UK?
I'll say the majority grown in conventional systems are grown for supermarket sale. There is also a large amount grown in the West for cider production, but there is also quite a lot grown for the wholesale and juice markets, and also certain varieties grown for processing too.
And Emma, what's different about the way we focus on top fruit from a nutritional perspective compared to other crops?
Okay, so a healthy plant that has got all of its nutritional requirements is far more resilient to fighting off any pest or disease. Nutrition is a really important part of growing any crop, but with trees, some crops can be in the ground for up to 30 years. I certainly see that a lot with cider production. You're always thinking ahead. It's not just about the here and now. So what we do in the present year with a tree is building fruit for next year. So we're always thinking ahead.
So what you're saying there, Emma, is that it's a much longer term view when it comes to nutrition for that crop. Matt, what would you add?
Well, as Emma's just alluded to, Tony, because these crops are perennial and they do have root systems and trunks and organs that hold on to those nutrients for the following year, if we have real turbulent weather like we've seen in previous years, and certainly in the most recent years with very heavy rainfall through the winter months, a lot of the nutrition that we put in the previous year that we hope will be there for the coming year might have been washed away through the winter. It might not be plant available. So that the level of investment that we make in year one isn't always returned in years 2 and 3. We need to continually assess it, look at the situation in that cropping year, and see if we need to make any adjustments.
And Ryan, for the crops that you look after, what's your view as to why this nutrition needs to be so right for top fruit crops?
The crops I generally look at are top fruit, apples and pears, and stone fruit, cherries and plums. Now, when I see that a grower hasn't given that plant the correct nutrition, you often see that plant is far more susceptible to pest and disease. And where we're seeing, like Matt alluded to, very turbulent and dangerous weather conditions, the plant is far less likely to withstand those conditions, and in some cases die and ending up having to be removed and replanted, which is obviously a huge expense to the grower.
And so, Matt, what are the key nutritional requirements of these crops?
So the key macronutrients that we need for most fruit crops, Tony, are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium. Probably the NPK element there, the same as what you'd find across most cereal crops and veg crops, but it's the calcium that's really key for us for cell division, cell quality, cell strength, especially with things like apples and pears, which I'm sure Ryan will talk more about later on. In soft fruit crops, we also have the requirement for those key nutrients. We might also have other nutrients that are vital as well. And in vine crops, things like magnesium, iron, manganese, they can all be really essential to the quality of the crop. Ryan's probably best placed to talk about the individual macro elements and to which crops they're most important for. But generally, they're the ones that we're observing and ensuring that we have optimum levels of.
And so, Ryan, what would you add to what Matt has just shared there?
So I'd say that two of the main micronutrients that are the most important in top fruit crops are probably boron and zinc, of which we like to apply and make sure the tree is sufficient in during the flowering and just before the flowering period. Now, sufficient amounts of boron and zinc, like I've mentioned, help strengthen the pollen tubes, which give us healthy, fulfilling flowers, which then eventually bore the fruit, the crop. Looking further into post-harvest nutrition, due to the fact that the tree before the flowering period in the growing season won't be actually using any nutrients from the soil, it will purely be residing on its carbohydrate reserves. We need to ensure that the crop has enough of these nutrients going through into the dormancy winter period, so that during that first point of growing in March, April, pre-bloom, the tree and the flower has enough to make sure the flowers are strong and healthy.
Matt, what similarity do you see between, top fruits, for example, here that we're talking about primarily, and those other high-value crops that people are producing, whether it's strawberries and raspberries or even through into cereals? It's all about attention to detail, right?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually, Tony, because let's take strawberries for an example. In the UK, nearly all strawberries are grown in an inert substrate called coir, which is essentially coconut pith. That material doesn't carry any nutritional value at all. So we have to fertigate the strawberry crop with just the right balance of all the essential nutrients the plant needs throughout its growing cycle at the right phenological stage to make sure the plant isn't going into a vegetative state and that it does have enough of the potassium, the calcium, the boron around that flowering period and going into the fruiting stage. So certainly for a lot of the crops we grow in the UK, which are no longer grown in the soil, nutrition is really, really key.
How do you as agronomists go into these crops and find out what the crop's nutritional requirements are? How is that influenced by the end market, what the grower is growing for, and how's that influenced by what you see the crop needs?
Thanks, Tony. Great question. So we've got the use of the Nutrient Management Guide, RB209, of which is updated every few years. And that can provide us with a really good database and knowledge on which crops and age of crop of which nutrient is required. Now, the RB209 guide that we use, which is section 7 for fruit crops and vines, can tell us near enough exactly the requirements for each crop. Now, during our crop walks and monitoring that we'll usually conduct every 10 to 14 days during the growing season, we'll be conducting visual assessments. So how well and how happy the plant is, the colour and productivity of the leaf and the overall plant. We can then look to conduct tissue and soil analysis, and when the time comes, fruitlet analysis, which will all tell us if the tree and plant is in or out of balance. As we've spoken about earlier on the podcast, we know that a healthy plant is a happy plant. So ensuring the plant has sufficient nutrients, whether that be calcium, potassium, nitrogen, or some of the micronutrients like boron and zinc, or even manganese. We need to ensure that the plant is sufficient in all of these nutrients. As we also see post-harvest, we can see post-harvest storage disorders in fruit, which can obviously cause us problems in the packing process.
And I know that tissue analysis has an important role to play in making your decisions. How often do you conduct that?
So generally twice per season is enough. Once after blossoming and then once around harvest time.
And how important is that simple visible inspection of these crops to go alongside your tissue analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a general rule of thumb. If there's anything that stands out, you can spot nutritional deficiencies by eye. So if there's anything that stands out halfway through the season, it's always advisable to take a sample then as well.
It's very interesting listening to all three of you as agronomists, how holistic that approach is towards looking after these crops, these trees, and that fruit.
Yeah, totally right there, Tony. We're not just there as agronomists to identify and rectify any pest and disease problems, but we're also making sure that the tree is nutritionally happy. So we're identifying any foliar deficiencies with the use of tissue and soil analysis as well. And it's all part of a pretty structured and regimented program to make sure that the quality and quantity of crop is as it should be.
If you would like to find out more about Agrii's fruit offering, including the latest trials results, please visit agrii.co.uk/your-crops/fruit. And Matt, how important is it to the grower and the end market that these precise decisions are made in terms of the nutritional inputs for these crops?
Yeah, I certainly say we're seeing a change, Tony, in line probably with the wider agricultural sector. A lot of our customers are also Red Tractor audited and other assurance schemes, so they need to be compliant with the materials they're using and making sure they're FIAS registered suppliers. But then also from the environmental perspective, I think there's a general feel as an industry that we do want to move away from these high energy consuming processes like bagged fertilizers and going back to more organic compounds and organic components that we can make soil dressings with. Obviously, with fresh produce like apples and strawberries, we are limited with that because we do have the fresh produce element of that, which carries a risk. So, for example, manures and things are restricted with very long harvest intervals because we wouldn't want any risk of bacteria and things getting onto the fruit. But where we can, certainly pre-planting of an orchard or post-harvest applications, growers are trying to use more organic components from locally sourced farms to try and reduce their carbon footprint.
So what are the role of biostimulants in this crop? Emma, can you start us off?
I think biostimulants is a subject in itself, actually, Tony. There are loads of different types of biostimulants, and they all have different modes of actions.
And Ryan, what would you add as being the benefits of biostimulants and how we can use them on top of what Emma has already shared?
So as Emma has spoken about, biostimulants can not only stimulate plant defences, they can also stimulate nutrient use efficiency, can inhibit pest control, and improve the availability of nutrients within the soil. So I think really there, Tony, are all the results that the grower can really use. You should have better resilience to pest and disease control. The plant can use the nutrients available in the soil a lot better, and overall will be a stronger and happier plant.
So perhaps, Ryan, you can give us an example of a product that you use and what the benefits are of that, and how does that help the grower produce the crops that they wish to?
Okay, so Proact is a biostimulant which effectively acts to prime the plants and can also assist with the uptake of calcium. Now, in top fruit crops, we will look to apply Proact maybe 2 or 3 times in the year, maybe around blossom time and petal fall, which is the growth stage just after blossom, and then maybe again just pre-harvest. We also know that Proact can provide some properties that makes crops more resilient to frost, which is great. Although, like Matt has spoken about, we're seeing these adverse weather conditions, which really are wetter winters, hotter summers, and occasionally, although not so much this year, later frosts, which in top fruit crops, which generally flower around mid to late April into early May, we can still suffer frost events during that time. So if we have plants that are far more resilient to frost, that will guarantee or at least allow a better quality and quantity of crop come harvest.
And Emma, how do these products fit within the programme you may be advising?
the biostimulants that I use in my products are really easy to apply with other foliar nutrition or fungicide rounds, for example.
And Matt, I know that Agrii are involved in trials, horticultural trials, fruit trials, for example. What work has gone on in terms of looking into the value of these biostimulants?
Well, Tony, as you know, Agrii are heavily invested into the R&D of future products for our growers. And you'll be probably quite surprised to hear that over 50% of the trials that we carry out each year are specifically for biostimulants. So we're really actively trying to develop this sector of the market that is still quite unknown and relatively new, so that we can get the best use from the products and our customers can get the best value from the products.
So let's start to think about some of the advice that you would like to share on this podcast to those growers who are listening today. Matt, maybe you could start us off.
Well, Tony, I would say think back to when you experienced a normal season in the UK. I think it's almost rhetorical. I don't recall one at all in the 9 years I've been with Agrii. We're seeing far more adverse weather events, really hot summers, very, very wet winters, protracted periods of wetness. And what that leads to is a cropping system where it's under enormous environmental stresses throughout the entire season. And quite often it's going from one extreme to the other. And all of that processes, what that does is it reduces the plant's ability to overcome stress and carry out its normal metabolic functions. So if we can use something like a biostimulant to reduce the stress impact on the crop around these weather events, then that's going to help it function normally and produce a crop.
And Ryan, what would you like to share as something to take away from listening to this podcast?
Okay, for me, Tony, it's probably monitoring. So that starts in the orchard, and that's crop walking with the grower, or the grower with the agronomist, and that's looking for foliar deficiencies on tree and in fruit, and that can also be assessed using tissue and soil analysis. Now, like Emma mentioned, we can also see the results of this go through to post-harvest and affecting shelf life. And I think we did mention earlier the importance of calcium, of which it's that crucial 6-week period after bloom at cell division and cell expansion, when calcium, or roughly 90% of calcium, is actually taken in by the plant. Now, one of the most common nutrient deficiencies that we see post-harvest in cold store is something called bitter pit. And now this is a calcium deficiency, most commonly seen in some of the older varieties like Cox and Bramley. Now, this will present as small brown pits in the apple flesh, and when severe, can be visible from the outside of the fruit. So if the fruit, like we keep talking about, isn't nutriently in balance, some of these problems can rear their head.
And Emma, what would be your top tip from today's podcast?
For me, it's very important. It's critical that you do those analysis to be able to know that you're giving the plant what it needs. If you don't provide the plant with what it needs throughout the growing season, the produce won't withstand the post-harvest life. And certainly for apples, the post-harvest life can be up to several months.
Well, thank you, Matt, Emma and Ryan, for sharing your expertise when it comes to nutrition for fruit. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you'd like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.